Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, January 13th, 2026. I'm John Budhoritz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, commentary contributing editor and podcaster, columnist, and all-around factotum at the Free Press, Eli Lake. Hi, Eli.
Great to be back, John. Thanks for having me.
Eli, I think for 20 years now, or close to 20 years now, you have been writing about the Islamic Republic of Iran and the political, geopolitical, sociological, religio-fascist implications of this regime's existence. And here it is, I think, unambiguously in the most challenging position it has faced in its 47 years of existence. When you read these reports, which now range from, I think, a minimum of 2,000 people killed by the regime in the last 48 hours to 12,000 killed, depending on your sources, but everybody agreeing that the regime is now basically opening fire on the protesters from sniper positions to whatever, and in cities across the country. Do you look at that and are you in a weird position of feeling like that's a sign of hope, or is the massacring a sign that the regime will somehow inevitably find its way back into quelling the resistance as it has so many times before in the last 20 years?
Well, I mean, it's hard. You can't say that the mass slaughter of demonstrators is any kind of sign of hope. But I think we can have two thoughts at the same time, which is that it's a sign that something, by the way, that privately Brett McGurk, who has been an envoy to the Iranians for both Republican and Democrat, including first-term Trump, but also for Obama and Biden. He says that the Iranian foreign minister privately told him that the reason why the regime stays in power is because it is willing to kill its opposition. He recently put that on Twitter, which, I mean, is of course true, but it's also extraordinary that the Iranians felt the arrogance that they were confident enough to say that to an American envoy. So this kind of shows that now what we're seeing is the regime's propagandists are pointing to what was clearly, I think a Potemkin rally in Tehran, but they have to try to say that because they are so loathed and despised. This is something also to keep in mind in terms of the cycle, particularly to Iran. It's a point that Karim Sajapour made. It's a point that I make in the podcast that we are going to republish this week, part 1 and 2 on the making of modern Iran, that the 1979 revolution, we date it in 79 because that's when the Shah leaves and Khomeini returns. It starts in 1978. And it's a year of uprisings, violent protests, and then public funerals for the people who were slain in the uprisings, which then attract larger and larger crowds. And that right there is a death cycle that the regime is now risking. And I would not be surprised if something like that happened. The other thing is to note is the Islamic Republic is...
Wait, just to interrupt you for a second. So you're suggesting that in the wake of the massacrings, that there might be funerals. The funerals themselves become flashpoints for continued
in the Shia tradition
protests.
Yes,
in the Shia tradition.
Right.
Obviously, wouldn't the counter be that the regime knows that as well as you do, and therefore would prevent, even if it is a violation of Shia burial law, that they would somehow prevent these funerals from taking place? They could simply hold the bodies and prevent any mass gatherings until everything pacifies. Or am I missing a beat?
Well, I mean, sure, they could. But again, that would be further ideological discrediting of the regime itself. So a regime that is anointed by God to basically rule the country through a Shia religious interpretation is not allowing traditional Shia burial for Iranians. That presents its own kind of legitimation crisis. It's, of course, they can try to do that, but at that point, I mean, they've already lost legitimacy as a, that they've already lost the kind of ability to say, hey, we are representing the word of God, and this is because they were unable. I mean, this people got the story from a month or two ago about they're not enforcing the hijab law, which is the face covering. That was not because the moderates got in the ear of Ayatollah Khamenei. It was because they could not enforce the hijab law. Literally, the morality police couldn't do it. There were too many people just saying "F you." So that's another thing to keep in mind, which is that each one of these things kind of builds upon something else. And so in that respect, it's been a long time coming. And the difference is that, it's, as we say, it started with the currency crisis with the Bazaris this time. I mean, yes, it did.
Who are the Bazaris?
Well, the Bazari is very important because that's the merchant class of the Iranian economy. And every major revolution has had their buy-in, starting with the 1905 constitutional revolution, which starts because of excessive sugar tariffs. And some would argue even before that, the end of the 19th century, there was a tobacco deal that the Bazaris also did not agree with, and they started protesting. And it's always been the idea that they would marry up with the clerical class, and eventually there was a reckoning at the end of the 1905 process around 1911. We don't have to get into the whole history of it, but the point is that they've played a major role, including in 1979. They were the last to sort of be there they weren't really a big part of the Women Freedom Life protests. The fact that they started it, the fact that the rest of the kind of country
Those were the 22 protests you're talking about.
Yeah, the 22
that were
protests.
about the morality police.
Right.
And their
By the way, we could date this back to, and I mean, a lot of people say 2009 with the Green Revolution, which we saw Obama abandon when the regime stole the election in favor of Ahmadinejad. To get a sense, by the way, of how far things have gone in Iran, I would point out that Ahmadinejad is largely sidelined, but when he has made public comments, he has called for a referendum, which is what the opposition's calling. He has said this is a corrupt regime, that we can no longer have reform. That's Ahmadinejad. Remember, he was the hardliner that the mullahs put in favor of the reform slate that won that election in 2009. I dated back to 1999, the end of the reform experiment with it was the end of the reform experiment, and it was also, there was a series of murders of intellectuals, but that was the first university uprisings. It didn't really get anywhere, but it made it pretty clear that the regime itself would not reform. And so we've seen this recognition and this understanding coming slowly but surely. So I just point out that we're not, the slogans in the streets are either surprisingly long live the Shah. So we're seeing how the son of the monarch that was ousted in 1979, that left in 79 because of the Islamic Revolution, is coming back, and he is the one national figure that everybody knows that might be able to sort of be a unifying presence. Fingers crossed. There are a lot of ifs there, but I just want to point that out. The other one is just like death to the dictator. Every single time, whether it's the drinking water crisis, it's not low. There's no fixing it at this point. It's just over for them. They lack that legitimacy.
Okay, but there are two faces of the Islamic Republic, right? One is this religious, dictatorial use of religion as an absolutist, and the other is it's just a classic totalitarian regime. So the Soviets didn't care about legitimacy. The Chinese don't really care about legitimacy. If you are, as Orwell would say, the boot on the human face forever, you just put the boot down on the human face. So therefore, we find ourselves in a position where it does. This is the big question: can this be done from the inside? Or you're on mute, Eli.
The answer to your question is yes and no. Stalin didn't care about public opinion. Khrushchev did. He gave a secret speech saying Stalin was excessive. More importantly, all these regimes care about public opinion. That's why they spend so much money on internal propaganda.
I'm not saying they don't care. I'm
Yeah,
saying that when push comes to shove, they
right,
bring the tanks out into the streets and mow people down by the thousands, and then they
right.
go back inside, which is where we are
So here's
right
where
this
I would,
moment. But Prague in '68,
sure.
and Hungary in '56, and Tiananmen Square, and I mean, there never was a real uprising in Russia until the failed coup, right in
Well, you could
1990 and
argue in
91.
1989.
Right, but that's what I'm saying.
Right,
But that was already the end of it. So I'm just
right.
saying that there is the situation in which the regime told Brett McGurk, the guy told Brett McGurk, we're willing to kill everybody, and they know it. And now they're willing to kill everybody, and everybody's going to know it. And so that's where step two comes in, which I think we should talk about.
Well, okay. Let me just say,
Okay.
though, there are a couple points to make here. One is each one of those mid level IRGC, Basiji people, they have a family, they have friends, they know people who at this point are affected. It is not so stratified a society that they are not affected by this. So that's the first thing. So there are a lot of calculations that we can't possibly know at this point. And the key for these revolutions to work is when you have disobedience in the military, in the security services. And that doesn't seem like a crazy point of view. In fact, I mean, we'll have to see. But, Pahlavi himself, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah, has said he has been in contact with military officers who've said that they are willing to defect to the side of the people. And so that's the first point, that I'm not entirely sure that it's going to work, that there is, for some people, it's not just a matter of conscience. It's a matter of, well, what are they going to do to me when this is over? I, many years ago, interviewed the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini. And at the time, I was very much taken by Gene Sharp and the theories of nonviolent civic resistance. And I asked him about this, and I almost wanted him to agree with me. And he said, that's never going to work, because all of the mullahs understand, and this interview was in 2005, I should say, all of the mullahs understand that as soon as they lose power, they are going to be murdered by the people because they've been so horrible. So that's probably an element there that they're fearing for their lives. But it's also an opportunity for some creative statecraft, some creative diplomacy, where we can offer a soft landing for those who want to get out early. There have already been signs of fissures in the regime. The president, Pezeshkian, has said that he wants to distinguish between rioters and protesters. That is not a distinction that Supreme Leader or Ali Larijani, the National Security Advisor, or the head of the IRGC, that they make. So that's already an interesting point to just say, that even in this regime of hardline goons, even some senior people like the president himself is saying that there is a distinction, that we need to do something to address these legitimate economic concerns. Maybe there's an opportunity to reach out to somebody like that, not to be part of a future Iran, but simply to say that you and your family can be safe when this inevitably happens. The biggest mistake that we could possibly make right now would be to begin any kind of negotiation with this regime. I cannot stress enough, I don't think Trump is going to necessarily do it. We know that he's used negotiations in the past as a ruse. I am hoping his comments in the last 24 hours were part of that, as this idea of a ruse. Today is the big day. He gets briefed on his options, military and cyber, for how to make good on his promise to the Iranian people. I am hoping that there are lots of things that can be done short of bombing buildings, although there's certain kind of symbolic things that we can bomb that would be helpful. And I would go so far as to say, if it's true, I mean, listen, we know the Mossad has an incredibly massive presence in Iran, and an effective one. I think it is slanderous that regime stooges are suggesting that the entire uprising is a result of the Mossad. We know that's not true, because the opposition has predated the Mossad presence, and my understanding is that those are two different lanes. But There are lots of things that Mossad can do to help advantage sharing intelligence, like the locations of these forces and so forth. And I would just say that I'm amazed, given the violence that began late last week, that we've still seen images that appear to be authentic from Iran that show that we still have massive crowds in the streets that are willing to do that. So I would not give up just yet, even though they are willing to use extraordinary violence. And there are things that Trump can do to make that very uncomfortable for the regime. He knows the locations of supreme leaders. I'm sure the Israelis know where military commands are, commander of the internal security forces, the Basiji militia, and so forth.
John, you're on mute.
Sorry, guys. So we need to split this up. So we've now talked about what's going on inside and the kinds of changes, the differences between this and previous revolts that the regime has put down with relative ease, I would say, despite the kinds of incredible optimism that were expressed during the times of previous uprisings, that this really might be it. This really might be the moment, which is one of the reasons why I'm skeptical, not that this isn't the moment, but that it can be done solely as part of an internal uprising in which, as you say, the military basically says, I'm sorry, we can't fire on our cousins and brothers and, people in our mosque anymore. We're just dropping our guns. So that is something that doesn't really happen in strong totalitarian regimes. The military doesn't break. And so I think that's maybe a false hope, which is why we have to get back to the question of whether we, the United States, you're mentioning Israel as a kind of subterranean force in helping create the conditions under which the regime might collapse. And obviously, we know about its penetration of Iran in all kinds of ways. But it's pretty clear to me that the regime falls if we, America, decide to get materially involved in. That's the only way that we're going to get to the final stage. And that's the fight that is now under discussion. And I would say it is worth having a discussion. Like, I am very supportive of this idea, but we are talking about a regime of 90 million people. We are talking about a very complicated and very large country, right? It's not, it's not Kuwait. It's not little, it's not a billion or two people, it's 90 million people, highly modernized in weird ways, all of that. This is not like Stripes. It's not like you drive in, you drive out. It's like going into Wisconsin. Like, this is a serious gambit. We did amazing work from the air in getting rid of the nuclear program, but we're talking about something else here. And it's always this question, which is the risk worth the reward, or are we getting ourselves in over our head if we're not willing to commit properly to doing this in the right way, getting the mullahs out, letting the regime collapse? And what do we envision as the day after?
Can I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
To that, John? I think we should be specifically emphasizing this concern, given that it's this Trump administration, because it's not as if the president has had a regime change policy or plan in place up until this point. There's this element of kind of wigging it now in response to what's happening, and that is more reason for concern. Again,
by the way, you
I'm
make
in favor of it, but
you make an important point, because we have a piece coming out in our February issue, which we close tomorrow, by Elliot Abrams, which is about Venezuela. And I'm only using this as an example. So he was, of course, the envoy, United States coordinator for the effort to get rid of the Maduro regime in 2019 and 2020 for the first Trump administration. And what's very clear as he tells the story is that our intelligence agencies did not want to go into Venezuela, did not really want to even provide plans for what we could do to oust the regime beyond merely using sanctions. And they were opposed to it. They weren't being forward about it, all of that. And I think you can imagine that the same is very much true of the American foreign policy and intelligence bureaucracy now. For 20 odd years, they have been opposed to American action inside Iran or against the Iranian regime. In fact, they were advocates for the JCPOA. They don't like Trump's adventurism, all of that. So that Trump, when he said, I need to hear these plans next Tuesday, part of the reason he had to say that, I think, even if it's part of a subterfuge, is I'm not sure those plans are really like off the shelf. Like, one of the easy ways that a bureaucracy can prevent something from happening is simply not providing a contingency plan. Like, he goes and says, how are we going to overthrow the regime? And they're like, I don't know. We've never really planned for that. That hasn't been our policy. And, and it's so hard. And, we're talking about committing forces that we're so overstretched everywhere else. And look how we all these people in Venezuela, we have all these forces in the Atlantic. How are we supposed to get them over to the Indian Ocean to put pressure on Iran? So he may not have options yet. That's the thing that
but he has. I mean, like part of the what doesn't worry me about the haphazard nature of it is that the situation with the regime seems to be like they're teetering, and Trump has options to stop them from regaining their footing, which is different from going in and overthrowing a regime that is set, concrete in power, which is that the protesters clearly have the regime on its back foot in a way that they haven't in some time. And we're seeing, Eli, you mentioned the president saying, all right, well, we'll have some reforms, and there's a difference between a protester and a rioter and whatever. This is the sort of thing that made it look like Mubarak in Egypt was over, because the second you're not Bashar al-Assad and gassing the protesters is the second that you are on your back foot. So for Trump, I think it's really just like the regime is wobbling. And his real objective is not even necessarily to push it over, but to just keep them off balance and stop them from regaining their footing enough for the protesters to continue what they're doing, which is just to have the momentum, and let the wave ride out.
A couple points. In Egypt, the United States had the advantage of our military had very close relations with the Egyptian military. And it was because the Egyptian military refused to disperse the crowds in Tahrir Square that ultimately forced Mubarak to resign. We don't have that kind of relationship, obviously, with the Iranian military or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. However, we have leverage. More importantly, our allies, which are in a tenuous position under the Trump years, let's be honest, also have leverage. Now, I've been disappointed by Canada, but Canada has been a haven for the children and extended families of many regime elites. That is an amazing source of leverage. Right now, the message needs to be sent. Ali Larijani, by the way, his daughter teaches at a nursing program at Emory University. Now, the message to Ali Larijani can be very simple. Your daughter seems to have a very nice life in Atlanta. Would you like her to continue to have a nice life in Atlanta? Or maybe you can send her back to your country where there's 5 million% inflation and everybody will hate her, and who knows how long she's going to last. That message can be sent 1,000 times fold if somebody in the Trump administration can quietly coordinate it with Canada, United Kingdom, France is another place. There's all these Western countries where the elites have sent their families and their children not just to be educated, they basically live there now, saying, all right, if you want your families to continue to live, if you care about your families, now's the time, step aside. You can join them and you can have a future, or you can, or we can kick them out, which is what we ought to start doing. And we ought to be very clear about that. So that's one source of leverage that we have, that maybe is a little bit different, but we can try to use the same kind of coercive diplomacy with the security forces. The second thing I would point out is, I think you're right. I don't think the intelligence community has any kind of transition plan or contingency for Iran, or if they do, they're so buried that, other people will block them from the president seeing them. But we know that Reza Pahlavi has addressed this issue with the Iranian diaspora for at least 5 years that I know of, probably more. We know that there are organizations like the National Union for Free Democratic Iran that has had many of these kinds of seminars with so much talent that has been forced to leave Iran. So there are people who are in a position who have studied this question. This is the kind of thing where, even though Larry Diamond is no fan at Stanford University, this is his specialty at Stanford.
No fan of Trump's, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, he's no fan of Trump's.
Yeah.
But this is an opportunity to take out one of the worst regimes on the planet. This is the kind of thing that I could see like Hoover teaming up with Pahlavi, and getting a kind of, the most talented people in the diaspora coming back, figuring out how to basically keep services running. And the other thing I would just say about the willingness to kill, maybe they will not be moved by their conscience, but the inflationary freefall, the collapse of the rial, affects the Basiji too. It's not like the average.
Okay, again, you're using terms people don't.
Sorry, the Basiji are the paramilitary that are often the front lines against the protesters. But it's only the very top level that lives in lavish luxury in Iran. Most of the grunts who have to do the hard work of suppressing the population are not living that much better.
Right.
They're living slightly better. But this economic contagion affects them too.
Okay, again, the problem that you're facing in describing this is you are talking about the question of whether or not massive civil unrest can unseat a deeply rooted 2-generation regime that basically is semi-totalitarian in nature. And I just think that world history tells us that has never happened. We have never seen a totalitarian regime collapse in that way under those conditions, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union, but that was even a weirder story.
Slobodan Milosevic, 2000, 2001, with the
but he wasn't. That was an authoritarian. That was not a totalitarian. By that point, did not have control of every state lever, with no mediating institutions whatsoever in his way. So that then brings back the question of what exogenous force, and you're describing some civil society exogenous forces, the question of whether or not a plan can be drawn up that will be, inventive and clever about what to do once the regime is deposed. It is the deposition of the regime that I want to get to. And
but I just want to push back slightly, which is to say that we're not in a situation where the regime can certainly use fear. It always has. That if you buck us, then it's curtains for you and your family. That's certainly true. But on the other hand, at a certain point, when your family can't afford, milk and chicken either, then those situations become desperate. In the great book by Eric Hoffer, True Believer, which is what are the conditions for mass revolutions? What he talks about is the sudden loss of status for people who we might call middle class into extreme poverty. That's usually the driver. We are seeing that in real time in Iran, and that doesn't just affect the bazaar merchants and the teachers and the oil workers, who I think are going to be going on strike if they already haven't already. It's also affecting the security thugs.
Right.
And I'm just saying that's something to keep in mind.
But again, what you're then talking about is a new thing. So, in other words, something this would be a new kind of revolution, and maybe it'll happen. So how do I know? Like, the world is a different place. It's not bipolar. I don't mean bipolar like mental bipolar. I mean, we're not a sort of Soviets versus us or the Chinese versus us. It's a different thing. And we have the major X factor. And the major X factor is that 2 weeks ago, the United States went and extracted the president of Venezuela in a daring raid and pulled him out of a building and flew him out of the country. And Trump looks at Iran and coughs, and Khamenei is saying, can he come get me? Does he now talk about teeth, like the real threat of regime change, and what you might call almost like, it's like Operation. It's like the game of Operation. Like, we've now shown that Trump, in the United States, can take the funny bone out without, hitting the sides and making it go zzz, like that. This is something that has really not faced Iran or any other regime. It's sort of like how Israel has redrawn the geopolitical map by doing things militarily that nobody thought that it was capable of, or that anybody was capable of necessarily, that changes the dynamic. So the question is, are we
let's
going...
add one more factor to that.
Yeah.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei does not have a clear succession plan.
Right.
The former president who died in the helicopter crash 3 years ago was largely thought to be the one who had enough support within the inner circle to succeed him once he died. He'd like his son to be the next supreme leader, but my understanding is he's not very popular, in part because everybody is looking around and saying, Khamenei, you've led us to ruin. Why would we trust the regime in the hands of your son? So if Khamenei strokes out, or finally the cancer gets him, or he is removed from power in some way, then that will create a succession crisis in Iran that would also lead to potential opportunities, because at that point you would have the elites fighting each other for who gets to be the next leader. Because
we should say he'll be turning 87 soon, so
Yes.
there is no long-term future for Khamenei. This is a fairly immediate question, considering his health.
So let's go to immediacy, because the thing that we're hearing, or the things that are being said, Muntz, the chancellor of Germany, others, it's like, this is over. This is the end game. We are in the end game here. Not Khamenei may get cancer, and we're talking about the next 6 weeks or month or something like that. Israel was supposedly going to do a major strike on Hezbollah last week, determined not to do it because it did not want to complicate or create more complex conditions when the mothership might actually be, at risk. And therefore, if the mothership can be taken down, taking down Hezbollah is obviously an entirely secondary thing, since it's basically a subsidiary arm of the regime in Iran. If the regime in Iran goes away, you can deal with Hezbollah at will almost after that. So Israel has already made geopolitical moves suggesting that it believes that things are very close to the edge if things happen. Not organic. I don't think that they think, or even that we think, or that the people that we trust inside the administration think that this is just going to happen Tahrir Square like. Although, Eli, as you say, Tahrir Square, we didn't do it, but we knew enough to know to give advice or counsel to the Egyptian military to say, you know what, it's not going to go well for you if you decide you want to fire on the protesters in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Better stand down. Like, let this play out. See where Mubarak is and see how he can save himself. We're not in that position here, but here we are going to have to take active steps if the regime is going to collapse in the next week and a half. And it feels like everybody thinks we're going to, doesn't it?
Well, but it does, because I think, given what Trump has said, he has to now. It's almost kind of like the situation he got in Venezuela. I mean, I don't know, what point he had it in his mind. He was determined to snatch Maduro, if he couldn't get him out. But given that Trump has repeatedly said, if there's a bloodbath, we're going to do something. Now there is a bit of a bloodbath. Doesn't he have to do something? Which I have another question here, which is that if you remember back in 2009, Barack Obama's cover story for not getting involved on the side of the protests in Iran was that the last thing that movement needs is to have the U.S. backing it. That will delegitimize the movement. They don't. We shouldn't have our fingerprints on it. He said that what he really wanted to do was rehabilitate the regime, and bring it in, get a nuclear deal and bring it into the system of peaceful nations or whatever. Is there could we push too hard somehow here? I mean, because I kind of feel, and this may be,
that's a very important look. You're making an ultimately very important point. Apparently, we're hearing that there is a debate of this sort going on to some extent inside the administration, with these camps that seem to now have hardened kind of into place, in which you do have a voice that is in opposition to the more activist, more militaristic approach of Trump in the JD Vance orbit, where Vance is talking about negotiating, and somebody says Witkoff should go talk to the Iranians and all that. And there is about it this question of whether or not our involvement, which is essentially the isolationist view, both in the horseshoe of the far left and this isolationist right, which is our involvement makes more problems than it solves. Like, at best, it ends up complicating and confusing the matter, and we don't know what we're doing, and we screw it up, and everything goes badly. And so let's not go do it in the first place. Clearly, Trump does not believe that of decisions he makes himself. If he makes the decision, then obviously it's the perfect decision, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. In fact, if you say there's something wrong with it, he'd like to throw you in jail if you even say such a thing. So if he goes in this direction, that's not going to be a good place. But pushing too hard, what would pushing too hard look like? I mean, we've already done maximum pressure, right? So we're already we've already done what the purpose of maximum pressure always was, given what's happened over the last month, which is, as Eli says, the real, the currency now has no international value. It is literally a dead currency, meaning that you cannot trade it you cannot go, to the exchange window at the Dubai airport and get yourself, some dollars for real. It has no value. So that is the ultimate point of sanctions, is to take the economy down. So they're sitting there like that. So the only thing that's left for us to do is some form of military intervention. That's the question.
No. There's
Okay.
cyber things that we can do that would blind the command and control of the internal security forces.
I mean, I consider that military intervention.
Okay,
but
fair enough.
I mean, a sliding scale of military intervention.
Right.
But also, I feel like that's less likely with Trump, because I think I take Abe's point, which is that I also think that Trump has put himself out on a limb far enough that he would do something that you could see. And I think that's how Trump works. So the cyber stuff may happen, it may not happen, but I don't think that he would use that instead of something blowing up. It feels like Trump would want something that the public can see so that he can point to it and say, remember when I did this.
Well, there's a lot of powerful things. I mean, listen, I would like to see a couple things blown up too, just to make it clear that, we're here. But the most important thing might be to take over the state-run broadcasting. We have the cyber capabilities to do that. Could you imagine if you saw a speech from Reza Pahlavi, hopefully from Azerbaijan, about to enter Iran, saying, I'm here. I have no, we're going to have a transition to elections. If you defect now, you'll be safe. All of those kinds of things are in the cards. So but I want to get back to what you were saying before about Obama's calculation and can we do too much and can we potentially ruin it? This is informed by a complete misreading of 1953 and the fall of Mohammad Mossadegh, which you talked about on the podcast yesterday.
So again, just very quickly, Iran in 1953 was governed by a semi-democratically composed government led by somebody named Mohammad Mossadegh, who was taken down in a coup for which the United States has been blamed for, since 1953, and for which Barack Obama 40, 50 years after the fact apologized to the Iranian people as part of his overture for the JCPOA. The story there is much more complicated, actually.
I think it's worth getting into the
Okay, so
complexity
please
of that
get
story.
into the complexity.
Okay, so
Because
first of
it's
all,
our original sin in Iran that has created. Why you want to bring it up, I think we need to explain, is that the world of the foreign policy cognoscenti, and when I was in my teens and 20s, learning about this myself, this was one of the original sins of post-war American foreign policy, that we had backed authoritarians against Democrats, particularly in Iran and in Guatemala, and that showed how bad our foreign policy was. And these progressives, where there were progressive things, and we did this, and then everything went haywire, and it eventually led to Vietnam and everything bad that could ever have possibly happened. So that is the sort of doctrine in which somebody like Barack Obama, from college political science classes onward, was bathed. That was the amniotic fluid of non-conservative foreign policy thinking. So get into the complexities
okay,
of this.
so the reason why we are obsessed with Mossadegh and why the left is so obsessed with Mossadegh is because of the worst timed memoir in the history of memoirs, which is that Kermit Roosevelt, who is the kind of mediocre grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, was sent by the CIA in 1953 after many efforts to negotiate with Mossadegh and come up with a kind of equitable. And by the way, like, this is during the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. Both Truman and Eisenhower wanted there to be a fair deal between Iran and the United Kingdom on, the ownership and the transition of the ownership of their oil fields. But it was worse than that, because what Mossadegh was doing by 1953 was his own kind of consolidation and illegitimate I wouldn't call it a coup, but it was certainly a power grab, in that he had already shut down newspapers. He'd already banned kind of criticism of him. He'd already violated Iran's constitution by trying to sideline the role of the Shah, which is part of the constitution. He'd done a number of things he also had disbanded the Majlis, which is their parliament. So he was becoming himself a kind of dictator. So the best thing
and all of this, again, you allude to this, but just to be explicit, all of this was about the nationalization of Iran's oil, which had largely been in the hands of the British.
Right.
Though I think it was American oil companies or Dutch and American oil companies that were pulling the oil out of the ground from Iran.
No, it was what became British Petroleum.
So it was BP. Okay, yeah. So the British had the kind of leases over the oil fields, and Mossadegh, as was true all over the world, was aggressively going at the idea that this is ours and we're going to nationalize it, and you're going to basically have to work.
And he was correct, by the way, that the original leases
were it's just funny because we're talking about this now in relation to Venezuela, so that all this is happening in these two different oil countries isn't entirely coincidental, but it is a little coincidental anyway. So Mossadegh wanted to nationalize the oil, and that created this crisis.
But we should say, if he just wanted to nationalize the oil, the United States was perfectly willing to support him. Mossadegh came to the United States as neutral third-party arbiters in this, and they largely sided with the Iranians on this. It was all of the other things. It was dismantling the Majlis. It was, cracking down on news, like arresting all these newspaper editors. And Mossadegh himself had lost support from the coalition that made it possible for him to kind of govern in this period. So what you saw in the months leading up to the so-called coup were a number of Iranian, even former allies and reformers, but most importantly, the clerics of Qom, which would, of course, be the font of the 79 Islamic Revolution, were begging the
The
United
city of
States,
Qom.
right, the
Yeah.
city of Qom,
Okay.
which is right
Yeah.
near, right, were begging the United States to get involved and restore a balance between the Shah and this out of control prime minister who was himself becoming, a dictator. Now, initially, Shah Reza, the current Shah Reza Pahlavi's father, was very unimpressive, and he was almost willing to go along with Mossadegh. He had already exited himself from Tehran. He was in his summer palace. There were rumors that he was leaving the country, which was looking like the end of the Pahlavi dynasty. And it was the CIA that effectively persuaded him and Kermit Roosevelt to fire, which was in his constitutional right, prime minister for violating the Iranian constitution. He ends up doing that. At first, Mossadegh has the guy who delivers the message arrested. Then there are massive street protests and demonstrations against Mossadegh. Now, the CIA has been effective at times and so forth, but that was not because of CIA and MI6 black propaganda. It was because Mossadegh had alienated almost every other constituency in Iran at the time. So he had sort of made his own bed. And that was the role that the United States played. Yes, there were some other things that they did in terms of, again, black propaganda, but they didn't know the lay of the land well enough. So they basically did their black propaganda in anti-Mossadegh newspapers anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered. But the point is that was the extent of it. The situation was already in a kind of political crisis. And so I always felt that this was blown way out of proportion. Now, what we should say then is that in this period, after the 1950s and the early 1960s, is an extraordinary example of, admittedly, Iran becomes incredibly authoritarian, and Pahlavi, we see the Savak doing all kinds of nasty things.
Savak
So that's
was the secret police.
That's the secret police. So that's on the negative side. But he introduces a series of modernization reforms that Mossadegh himself was the early advocate for. And most notably, what he does is he has a program to basically end the absentee land ownership of many Iranian elites, including the Shah's family itself, which relinquishes millions of acres of land and puts it in control of Iranian peasants, and then builds schools in the rural system that are no longer tied to the mosques, which is important. The literacy rate increases. This is a period of, in some ways, successful reform for Iran, and liberal successful reform. Women get the right to vote. So there are all kinds of things. And who opposes that? Who opposes the reforms, what was known at the time as the White Revolution, even though it wasn't a revolution? This is a few years later. It's a middle-aged cleric named Ayatollah Ali Khomeini, who would end up leading the Islamic Revolution.
Okay, you got to go back now to Kermit Roosevelt. You started this with Kermit Roosevelt's ill-timed memoir.
So he writes that memoir comes out, which should have been titled "How I Did the Coup in Iran in 1953" by me, former CIA guy Kermit Roosevelt. That comes out in 1979. That comes out literally the same year as the Islamic Revolution. So a book comes out which is by the CIA guy saying, "Hi, I did it." The same year we're trying to figure out what happened in Iran and why there was this huge revolution. So people think at the time, you have a lot of people, we all know their names. Elaine Shalino is on the plane. We have all these people who are on the plane with Khomeini coming back from Paris. He pretends to be this Democrat. He isn't. But if anybody who had studied Khomeini, one of the few ones was Bernard Lewis in the United States, who was at Princeton at this point, knew that Khomeini gets his start opposing giving the women the right to vote, opposing land reform, opposing having schools that are not teaching people only like religious tracts up to the 8th grade and actually making sure they know how to read. So that's Khomeini. Khomeini is a reactionary. And that's what his agenda was from the get-go. He was a very talented speaker. He was able to sort of connect with a lot of people because it was true that there was a vast difference between how the Shah and his court lived versus everybody else. There was incredible poverty, but at the same time, Khomeini was always this force of reaction. He manages to trick the world in 1979, in part because Kermit Roosevelt takes credit for
Right.
most of it in
Okay,
53.
you've made a really important. So Khomeini, as V.S. Naipaul famously put it in his book Among the Believers, the first really serious portrait of the rising Islamic war as a work as a journalism in the early 80s, said this was the 19th century opposing the 21st. That the Shah's regime was a modernizing regime, and you have to understand the Iranian Revolution as the most reactionary act of the 20th century, that it was a way of saying, no, stop, we do not want this. Women with the vote, like equal rights for men and women, a extremely educated middle and secularized middle class. This must stop. We must go back and retreat into Shia Islam, right? So what's interesting about this, and where it resonates with the conversation we were having about America going too far, is that the reason that Khomeini tricked everybody, and the reason that this argument was seductive to Elaine Shalino, who was the correspondent for the New York Times at the time that Eli is referring to, and others, Richard Falk at Princeton, whose op-ed about how we needed to trust Khomeini literally has been surfaced in the last couple of days and put on Twitter so people could read the psychosis that had afflicted the foreign policy establishment and, like serious thinkers at the time about this, is that it was fundamentally anti-American. It was, we're bad. Khomeini opposes us because we're being nice to the Shah, because we're letting the Shah come into the United States to get medical treatment, and we shouldn't even do that. He should be allowed to, rot with liver cancer at home instead of being at, New York hospital. And we should be taking revenge. And we're the original evil anyway, because we deposed Mossadegh and all of that. And then they fell prey. They basically sat there, liberal public opinion, conventional foreign policy opinion, and backed and supported the creation of this unbelievably evil, barbaric regime that has been a massively destabilizing and negative force on the planet Earth for almost half a century. So where are we now? We have people inside the Trump administration who are opposing military action to depose this regime effectively, I believe, on the emotional grounds that if we get involved, we're only going to screw things up because that's all we ever do. So who are they sounding like? Richard Falk, Elaine Shalino, everybody who said...
One more.
Okay, yeah.
Michel Foucault, the father of postmodernism, is sent by an Italian newspaper to cover the revolution and has nothing but praise for Khomeini and this pious movement that is no longer tricked by modern liberalism. It's the most insane stuff you could possibly read for this guy who is, by the way, a well-known, we should say, pederast and gay man who loves bathhouses in San Francisco. Is it's unbelievable. He's fashioning a rod effectively for his own back by saying, no, this regime is going to be great. It's going to be true freedom that we couldn't understand in the West. That sort of thing makes the Islamic Revolution for the revolutionary left seem like it's part of their movement. Like he's like Che Guevara or the, FLN in Algeria. Yeah. And what the reality is that he's a total reactionary. And the first thing he does is he tells women they have to be veiled, they can't vote. He does a series of things that are completely reactionary, but it still doesn't get the kind of coverage because there is this I told you so moment post-Vietnam. And again, I'd say Kermit Roosevelt's ego and the failure of the CIA to say, no, you cannot publish this book. What are you thinking, you moron? That was enough to kind of fix our understanding of Iranian history so that we believe basically this falsehood.
So here we are with the question of American action, right, in 2026. And there is clearly a weird gut response that says America shouldn't act because it's, it has a history of badness in its actions. And we also have this meme that has been going around. Various people have been doing this funny meme, right? Which is look at, in the wake of thousands of Iranians being mowed down by the regime, here is the scene right now at Columbia University. And it's a picture of the Columbia campus with literally nobody on the green. No one, no tents, no protests, no signs, nothing. Harvard, the same, everywhere the same. We literally have footage of mass massacres by an evil regime, the world's leading sponsor of terrorism for half a century, and no left-wing compendium of people is saying boo about the fact that this is happening. No demonstrations, no nothing. So this says two things to me. Number one, going back to 2023, this was not spontaneous. This was a 20-year plan by Qatar to take out Israel and to defame Israel's reputation and the reputation of Jews in the United States, and push us inside and indoors, because nobody is telling these sheep, these cattle, these loathsome DSA pieces of garbage that it's time for them to go back into and say it's bad what's going on in Iran, because of course they support Iran. The Middle Eastern Studies Department at Columbia University supports Iran. Mahmoud Mamdani supports Iran. They believe that the Iranian Republic is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Oh, so, yes. No, it's worse than that. I mean, we had Hamid Dabashi, who is a tenured professor at Columbia in the Middle East Studies Department, literally retailing regime propaganda that this whole thing was ginned up by the Mossad and the CIA. Right. And look at the crowds that were, the Potemkin rallies in Tehran that they had on Monday.
You're referring to the fact that there was a supposed rally in Tehran on Monday of supporters of the regime opposing these evil, terrible protesters who were simply being, who were in the pay of Jews, basically is what he said.
Well, what's worse is that it takes 2 seconds to think, if the people really support the regime, why has the internet been blacked out for nearly a week? And why are you doing all of this now, in light of the fact that we all saw the burning of the Qasem Soleimani statue and everything else before? So it's this utter mediocrity. This stooge is a tenured professor at an Ivy League university. Is a disgrace, and it's
part of it a department. That's the whole point. Part of a department and a discipline that has become the paid subsidy of the government of Qatar. They are simply agents of a foreign power hostile to the United States and world Jewry, and they have been functioning in this way now for 2 decades.
Well, I would go a little bit further. I would say it's also Edward Said, who taught at Columbia.
Right.
Famously wrote a book in 1980, who looked at the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and his big takeaway was the Western media is portraying the Iranian Revolution as a bunch of fanatics and maniacs, and boy, isn't that Islamophobic, even though he didn't use Islamophobic, he used some postmodern, more complex language. But the point is that this was Said's response to this huge hinge in history, and they've been following in the footsteps of Said ever since, and that's where we are.
Okay, lightning round as we conclude then. So Donald Trump is going to have a meeting today, if he hasn't already decided. He has said, "Don't fire on the protesters, or I'm going to do something." So, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being he does nothing, and 10 being he nukes Tehran. I don't know. What would 10 be? I don't know what 10 would be.
That he takes out Khamenei.
Well, 10 would be that he 10 would be that he Maduro's Khamenei, right?
Really? You think that's 10? Because I think that's more like 7. But okay. What do you expect in the next week? what number do you think Trump is going to land on? Is he going to try to do this on the cheap? Is he going to commit to it? The way he's handled this so far is once he does it, he sends 150 planes. He doesn't screw around. He went into Venezuela. There was a major operation involving, massive deployment of military resources. Is he going to do a little thing? Is he going to empower the Israelis? Is he going to do it? I don't know. Again, 1 to 10, 10 being not the removal. Okay, 10 is the Americans directly take credit for deposing the regime in Iran itself, the entire regime. And 1 is we do nothing. Pick a number where you think we'll
I think it'll be a 6, and we'll see. Like, I think the U.S. will turn out the lights in key ministries and effectively blind elements so that they will be impossible to do command and control. This is the same, by the way, the Israelis are the ones who developed this capability. But that'll be, I think, something that's definitely going to happen from what I've heard. But, you can't tell with Trump what he's going to end up doing. And I think it's also possible that you could start seeing key security leaders or military figures disappearing, getting killed. I don't know that the United States has that capability, but certainly Mossad does. And I also think that we have to watch Pahlavi at this point. Will Pahlavi have a meeting with Trump? And will Pahlavi has to travel to at least like the border of Iran, and he has to begin kind of a next phase. So I am here, I'm ready to lead a sort of transition to a democracy. So those are the things that I'm looking for.
I think he's going to do something that lights something up. I think there's already going to be cyber stuff going on. As in terms of taking credit for it, this is the only quibble I have with the scale of that being 10 is that if the regime falls, he's going to take credit for it after the fact, which is, so I think he's going to say, remember when I did this. But I also think I am expecting some kind of nod to a specific opposition figure, probably Pahlavi. I don't know if he's going to get an Oval Office meeting, but this is the sort of thing that I would think Trump is probably pretty close to tweeting about on Truth Social, which is enough, practically as good as a White House meeting for something like this. I think he's going to start getting more specific and start saying, so-and-so could really do a much better job of this. And maybe it's time that the people give him a chance or something like that. I think you'll hear that soon.
I agree with both my wise friends and colleagues here. I think a 6 on the overall scale. And I agree with Seth that it's going to be something visual. Something that Trump views as spectacular. What I'd like to see is the U.S. and or Israel take advantage of this moment to hit the ballistic missile program, actually. I don't know if that'll happen, but if he's going to blow something up, that's a good thing to blow up.
Okay, so I'm going to go with an 8, and I'm going to say that the one thing about the 8, as opposed to the 6, I think if it's a 6 or a 5, the real question here is what are the knock-ons? If the regime is not totally taken out, will there be a second strike? And is Israel at risk from remaining Iranian ballistic missiles? Because remember, an Iranian ballistic missile fired at Israel, that's 7 minutes, I think, something like that. Like there is no defense against an Iranian ballistic missile if it's launched. Can't be taken down in time unless we're watching and can do it from the air while all this is going on. So there could be major consequences from the 8. Or the 8 forestalls the major consequence. Because, one of the things we've learned in the last couple of years is there's always a lot of bluster about how Israel is going to fall and collapse and be cratered and destroyed. And there's a lot of paper tigering going on from the axis of Iranian evil, or very, very what you call impotent efforts at second striking or doing something in response. And maybe they're as hollow as you can possibly imagine, and they got other things to do other than just, oh, what the hell, we'll launch some ballistic missiles in Iran. They're like desperately trying to get out of the country. They're not really going to bother with, pulling the trigger there or something like that. But those are I think it's going to be bigger than you guys think. And I think but the thing I don't understand is whether the consequences outside are going to be way larger or way smaller. I would probably lean toward the way smaller, that they basically, it's like, well, we're done. Like, that's it. We got nothing left we got no arrows left in the quiver. Or they do the Macbeth at the end of Macbeth, which is, all right, I'm dead anyway, so I'm going to try to kill as many people as I can on my way out. But
well, I mean, I think part of that is that Bibi came to DC recently, and Trump basically told him, it looks like the Lebanese have missed the deadline for disarming Hezbollah. Maybe you should go in and, bomb Hezbollah's head off again or something like that. I think that was an indication that what you'll see is the Israelis prepped and ready for whatever aftershocks may happen in the region, whatever sort of last, death rattle type stuff might be going on. I think that's what they're preparing Israel for. And that's what Israel's role would be in this, is to, make sure to be ready to pounce on and weaken anything that happens, so that there aren't, mobs running at U.S. embassies, or there's no Benghazi type thing, and there's also no like rekindled war that you could call a new war, that he's able to say, we did this, it did not start a war, there were no basic things, basically like what he did when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and then he said, see, there was no intifada, there was no fire in the streets.
Can I add one more lightning round question that I think is relevant,
Sure.
and then we should go. But if this is successful or it doesn't lead to immediate catastrophe, what then happens to the sort of J.D. Vance block in both the influencer space? I mean, great timing, Megyn Kelly. And what happens to the broader kind of foreign policy elite establishment that has been telling us the same zombie mantra now for 20 years, that this regime is going nowhere and we have to cut a deal with them and so forth? Is there a moment where there's a discrediting kind of tipping point? Or will people sort of say, no, bad things are coming and we're going to double down and so forth? Will everybody just forget about it?
Vance gets on board retroactively, and the podcasters go on saying this was all a ruse for Israel.
I think that's probably right. I think the question of whether or not, if this happens in tandem with Venezuela, and if these don't turn into debacles over time, in other words, like if it doesn't look 9 months from now like, oh my God, look what we did in Venezuela, we were so irresponsible, we did this and then we didn't have a plan and everything is a mess and all of that. I think we see a major shift literally in the entire understanding of how foreign policy works on the planet for the rest of the century, that happens without a moment. There is no moment. It's more like all of the terms change over time, and the people who were the expostulants of the prior view kind of dissipate and go and work at investment banks and stop speaking about this over time. And the podcasters continue just to attack Israel and go and get more and more, and Jews in the United States, and get more and more anti-Semitic. And then they're existing in their own little bubble with their own audience. And yeah, Vance and others have to, because of the violence of their rhetoric, have to separate themselves, even if they don't really want to. Vance's notion that his future is built on using them as his sort of like base of operations is no longer operative.
which gets at a really important aspect of all these foreign policy things, if they that have worked so far, and if they continue to work on a large scale, which is, they've basically cured the patient of Iraq syndrome. It's going to become,
Right.
if Iran goes the way we're talking about it going, it officially becomes impossible to throw Iraq in the faces of everybody who suggests some sort of foreign intervention. By then you will have had the strikes with, no war and no American fatalities on Iran's nuclear program. You will have had the Venezuela stuff, the getting Maduro with no American casualties and no troops left on the ground besides, those we assume are, were there ahead of time or whatever, stuff like that. If Iran fall, and you had the same thing with Hezbollah and Lebanon, all this stuff. I mean, I basically think we're there, honestly, but Trump has done so many new things that have not resulted in that if something really huge happened, like the fall of the Iranian regime, without regional war and without, an American occupation, that's the end of Iraq syndrome, I think, once and for all, which would be very nice.
I would point out that after the Maduro operation, Megyn Kelly's guest was Aaron Mate of Gray Zone, which might as well be a PR agency for the Maduro regime. So that's not going to look great. I'm just saying it doesn't look great now. I don't know how that's going to go. And I often find myself, it's like, if I know about the American right, I think Eliana made this point last week, snatching a dictator, that hates America in a flawless operation, usually people on the right think that's pretty cool. So, good luck to you.
Eli Lake, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Stay tuned this week for the republication of Eli's Breaking History 2-part podcast on the making of modern Iran, which we heard a bit of in Chrysalis here, and you can get the full, what is it that if something's in Chrysalis in full bloom?
Yeah, you'll get the butterfly.
The butterfly, right, okay. And we will be floating back into your ken tomorrow. So for Seth and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.